The summit chamber was silent when the Kytherian delegate collapsed. No one moved to help her. No aides stepped forward. No medical drones activated. She curled on the ground, clutching her ocular ridges, weeping into her own fractal skin as if it would rewrite the memory. The feed from Subcore Vault 3 had ended 90 seconds prior. No one asked what she saw. No one dared. Across the chamber, a dozen representatives from a dozen species stared at the floor, their translated murmurs stilled, the treaty discussions forgotten. Commander Ruren Dask remained exactly where he'd been, standing, expression neutral, hands folded behind his back. He didn't gloat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The broadcast had spoken enough. It hadn't been a warning. It had been a demonstration. I didn't look away. I made myself watch her sob until the tremors stopped. I needed the discomfort. It was the only thing that kept the haze from swallowing me. My name was Varric Jol, Amviral Observer, Tier 6, credentialed under Articles 19 and 42 of the Quiet Treaty. I wasn't a diplomat, not a soldier. The Amvirel don't raise military branches. We don't need them. Our defense is found in prevention, in predictive modeling, neurosocial mapping, recursive behavior synthesis. We learn before others act. That has always been enough. Until Earth. Humanity didn't follow any of our models. They didn't develop in recognizable arcs. They bypassed entire civilizational thresholds, moving from cultural fragmentation to orbital militarization in under 2 centuries. No consensus, no transitional harmonics, no interspecies collaboration. We sent probes first, then statistical models, then inquiries. They responded with permissions, smiles, access, and always that expression, like we were being welcomed into a room whose walls we hadn't noticed. The High Circle reviewed everything and made the ruling. They needed something no algorithm could offer. So they sent me. I was called a neutral sensor, a living diagnostic node. My assignment was simple: observe humans up close, verify if they were anomalous or merely chaotic. I boarded the orbital station Echelon 5 during its open cycle rotation and was granted full clearance with ceremonial efficiency. No friction, no delays. They greeted me with pleasant nods and biometric clearance packets. They even made accommodations for Amvirel atmospheric preferences. I'd been posted to a dozen civilizations. This was the only one that adjusted its infrastructure before I'd arrived. I told myself it was a gesture of diplomacy. I was lying. My first formal invitation came the next cycle. Escorted access to Subcore Vault 3. The humans called it an unrestricted cultural archive, a shared repository of humanity's military, diplomatic, and psychological past. I expected categorized logs, treaty transcripts, perhaps some carefully curated battle footage. Instead, I walked into a room that had no terminals, just a single, adaptive neural interface calibrated to my species. They didn't offer assistance. They left me alone with it. I activated the interface and began. At first, it made no sense, not structurally, not ethically, no timeline, no abstraction layer. The files weren't indexed by date or military phase. They were seeded by emotional response curves. You didn't search the archive, you reacted to it. Every file was a lens. Every lens redirected your context. And when I finally saw the name, Ketterfield Resolution, I selected it because it had the lowest emotional impact score. I wanted something benign. I thought I was protecting myself. The file didn't begin with combat. It began with hunger. 12 Terran soldiers cut off behind enemy lines on a world whose name no longer appears in any Amviral registry. Their supply lines were broken, comms severed. They were listed as assumed lost in the diplomatic exchange logs. But they weren't dead. They were planning. The file showed recordings from their body cams, though it became clear the recordings were never meant for command review. They were rituals. They repeated phrases to each other, phrases that mimicked the enemy's religious texts. Not mockery, adaptation. They altered syntax, adopted cadence, infused symbolic references with tactical overlays. By the second day, they were carving revised iconography into captured outposts, not for human eyes, for the enemy's. By day 3, an entire battalion of enemy troops defected. No fighting, no casualties. They just walked, weapons down, toward the Terrans. They knelt, and the humans, filthy, starving, wounded, stood as if this had been the plan all along. I watched the feed twice, then 5 more times. I tried to parse the sequence rationally. No physical coercion, no chemical influence, just exposure to symbolic contamination. The Terrans had rewritten the opposing forces' cosmology using nothing but language, mimicry, and context collapse. I tried to slow my breathing. I told myself it was an outlier, that maybe it had been enhanced, for dramatic effect. But the footage had no editorial marks, no timestamps removed. It was raw. If anything, it had been softened. That was when the static buzz in the interface resolved into a single phrase, echoed in my neural translation band. You expected warfare. You found instruction. I didn't remember standing, but I was on my feet, back pressed to the archive wall. The neural link pulsed in my spine like a second heartbeat. I terminated the session, not because I'd reached the end, but because I couldn't be sure I hadn't already begun believing it. Hours later, I walked into the diplomatic chamber and saw the Kytherian delegate sobbing on the floor, clutching her own temples. Another had likely chosen the same file. No one helped her. I didn't either. I just watched Dask across the room, still and quiet, eyes on everyone and no one. I don't know how long we stood like that, the whole room paralyzed. The file was still echoing behind my eyes. And that's when I whispered, not to anyone, not for any record. This isn't history, it's a virus. They reassigned me before I had the words to protest. Not that I would have. The High Circle's decision arrived encoded and final, short, silent, surgical. Integrate deeper, move from archive-level analysis to subject-level observation. Effective immediately, I was to shadow a ranking Terran officer of their diplomatic command structure. I was still reeling from the vault files, still trying to scrub the Ketterfield footage from the base of my visual cortex. And now they were sending me closer, not to the periphery of Terran culture, to the core. His name was Commander Rurin Dask, head of diplomatic security for the Terran Directorate. His portfolio was thin by Amvirel standards. No childhood logs, no vocational drift modeling, no emotional index mapping. His presence in the interstellar register was almost absent, just a series of timestamps and appearance confirmations at major summits. The silence was louder than a dossier, and when I finally met him, I realized that was the point. He was still, not passive, not tense, still. A kind of stillness that made you want to fill the air around him. You'd find yourself speaking faster, justifying things you hadn't been asked about. I watched as envoys tripped over each other explaining positions they had no reason to disclose. A Thal emissary once apologized for a border violation that hadn't occurred. A Yirav diplomat offered a full trade concession after a handshake. At first, I logged it as charisma. Humans are known for emotional variance. Maybe he projected some kind of subtle, empathic field, but no device registered it. No atmospheric shifts. No biochemical triggers. Dask didn't move people. He made them move themselves. With every word he didn't say, every silence he held just a moment too long, it was as if he didn't need leverage. He was the leverage. I began recording his movements under the standard observational directive. I followed him through 3 summits, 5 negotiation chambers, 2 memorial observances, and 1 classified intelligence briefing whose very nature required that I not acknowledge its existence. In each case, the outcome tilted, not wildly, not visibly, but measurably, in Earth's favor. He never threatened, never asked for more than protocol allowed. Yet somehow every agreement leaned toward his side of the ledger by the end. Others left the room relieved, pleased even, like they'd escaped something without knowing what. But it was the Eidolon summit that clarified everything, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The Eidolon summit was designed as a display of unity. Earth had called it to finalize trade normalization protocols between the fringe systems and the Terran expansion corridor. A formality, really. All parties were already compliant. The chamber was filled with representatives from 12 species. I was seated 2 rows from Dask, positioned to observe, not participate. The summit began on schedule. Introductions were made. The agenda was shared on the neural overlays. Then everything broke. Without warning, the diplomatic command feed from Earth cut out. Delegates blinked in confusion as their translation overlays froze. Emergency beacon status dropped to undetectable. Secondary redundancy networks, used for crisis response and hostile incursions, flickered offline. For 37 seconds, the entire room was blind. I watched the panic rise like steam. Hands gripped comm implants. Species with redundancy glands began shedding body temperature. The Iralti began muttering protective scripts. The Draskal initiated a silent mobilization posture, claws twitching, shoulders widening. No one spoke aloud, but the conclusion was unanimous. Earth's command had been neutralized. And Dask just sat there, perfectly composed. No movement, no alarm. He didn't reach for a device. He didn't explain. He watched. His eyes scanned the room, one delegate at a time. He recorded every reaction. Then, at precisely 38 seconds, the systems came back, smooth, seamless, as if the interruption had never happened. The overlays resumed, the summit continued. But it was already over. Within the next hour, I received silent confirmations of fleet repositioning from 6 factions. 3 observer nations activated sleeper protocols, 2 accelerated retreat logistics from Terran-adjacent corridors. None of these were announced. None appeared on the formal record. But I knew what I was seeing. Dask had watched a room of enemies, allies, and unknowns reveal everything in response to a fabricated threat. And he hadn't lifted a finger. I confronted him afterward, not directly but through proximity. I lingered in his post-session corridor path, the way analysts do when they want to be seen without asking to be noticed. He paused when he passed me, looked me in the eyes. "Aye. You saw what you needed to see," he said. That was all. Then he walked away. I didn't sleep that night. I reviewed the summit recordings twice. Then again, without audio, focusing only on facial micro-motions and posture shifts. What I saw was worse than any attack. Humanity hadn't tested its own defenses. It had tested everyone else's, and they'd failed. The next morning, I sat at my station, reviewing my logs. The entry from 2 days prior labeled Dask with the tag Charisma. I stared at it for a long time. My hand hovered over the neural slate. Then I deleted the word. I replaced it with one that fit better. Predation. I wasn't escorted by guards. There were no restraints, no holding cells, no questions asked. They simply redirected my clearance, without notice, without warning, to a secure subdeck 37 levels below the main diplomatic tier. No one said the word detainment. They called it reflection. A pause. A chance to observe without interference. But when the lift sealed and dropped without destination input, I understood what it really meant. Earth had stopped pretending. The analysis was over. Now came the understanding. The deck was sterile, not cold, not dim, not dramatic. Just clean, white-lit corridors with matte-finished floors and no visible surveillance. It felt like walking inside a machine designed for thinking, not watching. At the end of the hall, a single chamber opened to my retinal scan without hesitation. Inside, Commander Dask. Standing by a console with no visible controls. He didn't greet me, didn't demand anything. He simply stepped aside and motioned toward the central interface, a sleek plate embedded with neutral neural ports calibrated to my cranial array. "This is unrestricted," he said. "Not a boast, just a fact. Everything. No filters, no summaries, context intact." I stood still, unsure whether to comply or retreat. But that wasn't the question anymore. I'd already seen what the edges of their culture could do. Now I was being offered the core. There would be no second offer. I approached the interface, connected the ports, and opened the archive. I braced for brutality, for blood and fire and kinetic trauma. I expected the kind of horror that made empires harden their borders. What I found instead was worse. I found design. Intent so precise it couldn't be explained by instinct or chaos. These weren't accidents of evolution. They were strategies engineered from the bones of behavior itself. The first node triggered was Project Korvax, not a Wawawas. Eepin, not even an agent. It was a diplomatic AI trained on millennia of emotional language patterns, linguistic uncertainty principles, and cultural bias loops. Its sole purpose, to answer foreign dignitaries using sentences that were emotionally resonant, but semantically empty. Korvax never lied. It never confirmed. It responded in ambiguity so calibrated that alien leadership began to second-guess its own definitions. Treaties collapsed, not because Earth refused terms, but because the other side no longer trusted what they themselves had offered. I watched one negotiation fall apart after Korvax said, "You're closer to the truth than you fear, but farther than you think." That was it. One sentence. The fallout lasted 8 years and ended in a regime change. I tried to disengage. I couldn't. The interface didn't lock me in. It compelled me forward. The next node activated. Operation Runewell. I assumed at first it was some form of covert messaging, but the logs showed no words, no content, no payloads, just carefully timed frequency modulation, inaudible to humans, but perfectly disruptive to alien circadian systems. Broadcast through diplomatic infrastructure, Runewell destabilized sleep patterns in 3 enemy species during peace talks. No one knew why their ministers became irritable, why leadership cycles collapsed under fatigue. Earth never raised a hand. They just waited for the exhaustion to do the work. Still no weapons, still no violence, but the outcomes were absolute. Then came the Lagrange betrayals. I saw the colony logs. 3 Terran outposts, abandoned, allowed to fall under hostile acquisition. No resistance, no rescue attempts. The human response wasn't silence. It was grief. Grief so global, so visceral, that enemy systems with shared ideological values began broadcasting condolences. Rallies appeared on alien worlds. Speeches of solidarity. One alliance offered to host a Remembrance Day. Within weeks, their own citizens turned against them for not doing enough. Internal fractures, coups, collapsed coalitions, all over people they had never met. Earth mourned publicly, and then moved on. But the empathy they triggered in others became a weapon those others never saw coming. None of this had happened in a battlefield. It had happened in headlines, in memorial services, in art, in shared pain. Earth didn't occupy planets. It occupied meaning. I watched 117 hours of campaign nodes. No breaks, no sleep. My perception of time dissolved. Each file peeled another layer off what I thought I knew. Propaganda wasn't a side effect. It was the operating system. Memory wasn't history. It was terraforming. Earth reshape. The moral topography of every species it encountered, not through force, but through story. By the time I pulled myself from the interface, my mouth was dry. My vision pulsed in bursts. The chamber was empty. Dask was gone. I hadn't noticed him leave. The lights hadn't flickered. No alerts had sounded. I checked the timestamp. I'd been inside for nearly 5 days. I stood slowly, trembling without cause. Not out of fear, Not even understanding, just the realization that I'd been given access not to secrets, but to the structure of how secrets were made. I sat down in the corner of the chamber, opened my personal slate, scrolled back through my notes. I found the phrase I'd written at the start of the assignment, the one that made me feel like I had any grasp on what I was doing here. They fear being misunderstood. I highlighted it, deleted it. I typed what I now knew to be true. They fear being understood. The moment I severed from the archive, I knew I was finished. Not injured, not compromised, just done. Whatever purpose had once shaped me into an observer, a sensor, a precision tool of the Amvarel High Circle, it no longer applied. The calibration was wrong. The entire framework was obsolete. The humans didn't break me. They didn't even try. They simply showed me what they were, and left the rest to happen on its own. I sat alone in the neutral re-entry suite, staring at my hands, letting the gentle hum of environmental systems echo across bone. For 12 hours, I said nothing. Not aloud, not to myself. I was afraid that if I spoke, something else might answer. When I finally keyed the uplink, I didn't format a briefing. I didn't sort analysis or arrange deliverables. I opened a blank neural stream and submitted only one message: my resignation. The reply came 5 minutes later: denied. There was no anger in the response, no scolding, no bureaucratic ritual, just instruction. Continue observation, deepen exposure, attempt replication, and the worst line, tucked in like a formality: report weaknesses. Weaknesses, as if they could be charted, as if humanity operated on a scale where vulnerabilities could be dissected like logic chains or metabolic gaps, as if you could find a chink in a machine whose primary function was to rewrite you into a component. I stood, crossed the suite to the small mirror embedded in the bulkhead, looked at myself, said my name aloud. Varric Joel. It felt wrong, not mispronounced, not forgotten, just incompatible, like it belonged to someone still playing a game with rules, someone who hadn't seen the board burned and replaced with a story no one agreed to tell. I burned the uplink, not metaphorically. I activated Cascade Flare on all High Circle COM ports, reverse-fed false encryption requests until the channels fragmented. I watched. The links flicker to zero, not with defiance, but relief. The system didn't scream. It didn't fight. It just let go. Like even it understood the futility of arguing with what I'd become. Disappearing wasn't difficult. Humans taught me how. They didn't show me explicitly, no guidebooks or instructions, but they lived it. Vanishing was part of their design, obfuscation as culture, redirection as second nature. I forged a subvessel transfer aboard a decaying freighter cluster listed under salvage directive, changed my biometric tags, modified ocular tones, no alarms triggered, no pursuit followed. I left the orbit of Terran influence under the signature of a decom platformer. I fled to Ashari Null. It wasn't a planet. Not anymore. A comms-dead moon orbiting a collapsed gas giant in the Virith Drift. Once used as a remote observation vault, then decommissioned and buried beneath archival rubble. No functioning satellites, no tracking pings. The stars above were unfiltered, untouched by comm interference. The silence wasn't an absence, it was pure. That's why I chose it, not to hide from pursuit, to hide from language. I shut down everything but life support, began the memory cascade manually. Each day, I erased a layer, not to forget what I'd seen, but to prevent it from growing. I'd learned enough from their archives to know that memory wasn't a static thing. It evolved, it infested. The more you reflected on it, the more it rewrote you. I didn't want to be rewritten. I didn't want to become another Terran echo wearing Amvarel skin. So I stripped it all. Neural lattice first, pruned long-term access to linguistic cores. No more speech, no more translation cues. After a week, I stopped dreaming. After a month, I forgot how to formulate questions. Eventually, even my inner monologue fell quiet. That was peace, or something close to it. But before I erased the last of it, before I let go of what my species called identity, I left one message, no address, no encryption, just a single broadcast keyed to a decaying amviral beacon orbiting a deep forget relay. Do not engage, do not translate, do not think you are immune. They will absorb your logic. They will turn you into a story you do not write. That was the only truth I could still name. Years passed, or maybe cycles. I lost the calendar. I stopped measuring. That was the point. No pulses, no frequencies, just the slow rotation of dead rock under foreign stars. Sometimes I watched the relay glass, not for signals, just to remind myself the stars were still out there, still moving, still unconcerned with what I'd left behind. But once, just once, I caught my reflection in the panel, faint, cracked, barely visible. I saw a mouth that didn't move, a name that no longer fit, a face that had stopped waiting. And I watched the stars, not hoping, just making sure they never sent anyone back. 11 years without language, 11 eclipses without a single Terran frequency crossing the silence. I hadn't heard my name spoken aloud since the last shadow fell across Ashari Null's pale stone. Not from another voice, not from my own. I stopped marking time after the 4th year. The mind loses count when there's nothing left to count for. I lived on what the outpost had left, nutrient slurry recycled from decaying bioresin, stale oxygen loops, water condensed from the thermal crust. There were no data pads, no uplinks, no system cores that processed external signals. The archives were disconnected and burned. I slept in a rotation cell with no clocks. I built no schedules, followed no rhythms. I didn't read, didn't speak, didn't engage with anything that could remind me of structure. That was the point of Ashari Null, sensory exile. But it turned out there's a kind of noise that silence doesn't erase. It just buries it until it grows teeth. Some nights, never predictable, never patterned, the relay glass would crackle faintly. Static. Not enough to trigger diagnostic repair. Not enough to blame on solar drift. Just enough to suggest. It would build slowly. Grainy flickers across the inner display. Unresolved pulses across non-functioning input ports. Once, I thought I saw movement in the screen's reflection. A shift, a step, a shadow just behind me in the corridor. But when I turned, the room was as empty as it always had been. The static would fade by morning. But I learned not to sleep near the relay anymore. I never spoke of it. Not that there was anyone left to hear, but sometimes I found myself pausing mid-step, listening, not for sound, but shape. A rhythm I'd heard before. Footsteps, human ones, precise, heavy in the heel, light in the toe, not the float of an amvirel, not the scuff of a translator species. Boots, military issue. Phantom movements echoing in core. Riders that hadn't held life in over a decade. They weren't hallucinations. I knew the difference. The Terran files taught me the difference. These weren't inventions of fear. They were residue, cognitive runoff left by ideas too dense to ever fully be erased. I'd stripped my mind down to framework, and still, Dask's voice would surface without permission. Not in words. In cadence. In weight. In those silences that didn't feel empty, but prepared. Tactical empathy, they called it in the vault files. Engineered emotional calibration. Responses tuned not to express sincerity, but to simulate it so precisely the brain couldn't tell the difference. "You're not our enemy," he'd said to me once at the end. "You're our mirror." I hadn't understood then, not even close. I thought it was a kindness, a diplomatic bridge, something said to diffuse what couldn't be named. But in the years since, in the quiet, I began to feel the shape of it. He didn't mean I reflected their image. He meant they had calculated mine. That whatever I was, observer, analyst, amvirel core logic specialist, had already been anticipated, modeled, reduced to function, and used. I had never been outside their game. I had been part of it. Every silence I kept, every report I filed, every moment of confusion I mistook for clarity. It had all been read, not intercepted, not monitored, read, the way a machine reads current, the way a trap reads breath. There were no threats in the message Dask left me, just that one line, one truth, enough to plant itself in the deepest part of the mind and wait. For what? Not awakening, not revenge, for recognition. That final reflex before a system breaks and realizes it was never autonomous. That's what isolation does. Not strip you of others, it strips you of false authorship. I had fled to Ashari Null to escape their logic. But the truth was, their logic brought me here. They didn't need to chase. They'd already calculated my endpoint. And as I sat there, in the half-lit control nest beneath the relay glass, I saw the flicker again. Different this time, not random, not erratic. Targeted. A systems flicker. Root-level diagnostics, stuttering on a loop that had never self-corrected before. Something wasn't broadcasting. Something was accessing. No alarms triggered. No pings registered. Just one light on the console that shouldn't have been there at all. Slow, steady, blinking in a rhythm I almost recognized. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched. And waited. The outpost's battery array dropped below viability threshold on the 7th solar rotation since the diagnostic flicker. I didn't repair it. There was no point. Letting the systems fail was the first honest act I'd committed in years. This place wasn't meant to survive. Neither was what I used to be. I stood beneath the relay glass one last time, not to transmit, but to offer the only thing I had left. My presence. Not in word or format, not in syntax or schema. Just a raw neural snapshot, undiluted and untranslated. A stream of memory, stripped of intention. I let the scanner take it all. The echoes, the residue. The long, slow breakdown of a mind trying not to remember and failing anyway. There was no encryption, no obfuscation. If anything found it, it would see me as I had become, unwrapped, unfinished, and unarmed. I had long since abandoned the idea of escape. That was the last delusion the archive burned out of me. Escape implies you're being chased, but humans don't chase, they shape. You flee in the direction they've already prepared for you, into the identity they already built with your own data, into a conclusion that completes their narrative arc. There is no outside, only layers. I used to wonder whether they were evil, whether what I saw in the vaults was some hyper-optimized cruelty. I don't think that anymore. I don't think in categories like cruelty or kindness. That's the trap. That's the frame they want you to use. To believe there's a moral axis at all. What they build isn't malevolent. It's functional. They aren't storytellers. That's too passive, too accidental. They are story shapers. They design context, engineer interpretations. They don't destroy civilizations with weapons. They collapse the reasons those civilizations had for defending themselves. You think you're fighting them, but you're not. You're fighting your own premise, one they rewrote, without touching you. When I think of Earth now, I don't see fire or conquest or brutality. I see calibration, precision architecture of influence. Their weapons are rituals, grief, empathy, silence, the manipulated weight of a pause, the resonance of a shared glance that means different things to different species, and all of them wrong. They don't need to win wars. They just wait until you don't remember why you fought. The relay pulse began to fail mid-cast. I knew I had seconds before the processor burned out entirely. I stepped back from the glass. I accessed my identity protocol manually for the first time in over a decade. The biometric scan ran slow, like it had forgotten how to read me. When it finished, it displayed my designation. Varric Jal. I said it aloud. It didn't land. The sound passed through my throat and into the dead air with no recognition, no belonging, like I was borrowing someone else's label from an era that no longer existed. The lights flickered for the final time. The room dimmed. There was no warning chime, just the soft decay of temperature regulators giving out. I sat in the control cradle and watched the stars through the cracked pane, eyes open, breathing shallow. I wasn't afraid. Not of death, not of them. Just awed. Not by their dominance, not by their force, but by their structure. By what they had built beneath the surface of every interaction. The scaffold beneath the illusion. The frame that held every outcome before it was visible. That was the truth they never hid, because no one knew how to see it. I was sent to study humans. I finished my study. And now, I pray I never meet another. What do you think? Was Jal right to run, or was humanity's strategy a necessary evolution? Would you trust a species that can rewrite your reason for fighting without ever drawing a weapon? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear how you would have handled Earth. Hit that subscribe button for more interesting HFY stories.